the city of law, order and civilization, or so we're told. But what if the same empire that gave us aqueducts and democracy once staged a blood-soaked reality show where over 1,000 people were killed in a single afternoon for the crime of believing in the wrong god? Forget lions versus gladiators. This was the world's first industrialized massacre, live in front of 50,000 screaming fans. And it wasn't justice, it was entertainment. Today, we're peeling back the marble facade of the Roman Empire to reveal one of its darkest spectacles, the day the Colosseum became a slaughterhouse for Christians. What happened inside those walls will shock you, not just because of the gore, but because of how chillingly modern it feels. Corporate propaganda, state-sponsored violence, a cheering audience complicit in mass murder. This wasn't just ancient Rome, it was a mirror of ourselves. They called it civilization. Marble columns, aqueducts, libraries, laws written in bronze so that no man could plead ignorance. Rome sold itself as the crowning jewel of human progress, the empire that dragged a violent world into order, and for centuries people have believed it. The Roman Empire, we're told, was the birthplace of reason, justice, and even democracy. But if you peel back the marble, if you scrape at the paint, you find rot, you find blood, you find a system where cruelty wasn't a flaw of civilization, it was its heartbeat. Take the Colosseum. Officially, it was a gift to the people, built with the spoils of conquest, financed by plunder from Jerusalem, presented as a monument of Rome's generosity. A place where rich and poor alike could sit shoulder to shoulder, fed free grain, entertained by free shows. Politicians called it bread and circuses, a clever trick to pacify the masses. You didn't need justice if you had spectacle. You didn't need dignity if you had distraction. And what a distraction it was! The Colosseum gleamed like a promise. 50,000 seats, retractable awnings, even elevators, hoisting cages of exotic beasts. Today we marvel at it as architecture. Back then, Romans marveled at it as theater, but the shows weren't plays. They were executions. The walls weren't painted with art. They were painted with human blood, and yet the empire called it culture. Imagine Madison Square Garden, rebuilt not for concerts, not for basketball, but for state killings. Picture an empire bragging that the slaughter of captives is proof of their sophistication. That was Rome's branding. They called themselves the most advanced society on earth, while feeding men, women, and children to lions for applause. It's like bragging about your enlightenment while live-streaming public beheadings. The irony is suffocating. Senators debated philosophy in the morning, then walked down marble steps in the afternoon to watch human beings burned alive. Scholars wrote about reason, while cheering as bodies were torn apart. Rome had laws protecting property, contracts, even animal welfare. But human life? If you were poor, foreign, or worse, Christian, you were disposable. You weren't a citizen. You were fuel for the spectacle. And this wasn't hidden. It wasn't a dirty secret. The Colosseum stood at the very heart of Rome, a monument visible from every hill, its brutality ringing out in cheers that echoed across the city. Every brick declared, "This is who we are. We are Rome. We kill, therefore we rule." What's most chilling isn't just the violence. It's the normalization. People didn't gasp. They didn't avert their eyes. They bought snacks, placed bets, shouted for blood. The empire had perfected the art of cruelty so thoroughly that mass killing became a family outing. Fathers brought sons, mothers brought daughters. It was entertainment for all ages. Rome dressed its barbarism in velvet and marble and called it progress. And on one particular day, the velvet curtain dropped lower than ever before. A day when the empire's need for novelty, for shock, for distraction, pushed the games into a new abyss. It wasn't gladiators, it wasn't lions, it was something darker, something that would echo across history. Because on that day, Rome didn't just execute criminals, it executed belief itself. 1,000 Christians paraded not as enemies of the state, but as props in a macabre theater of control. The Colosseum was never just a monument of civilization. It was a trap, velvet-lined, sold as generosity, hiding a slaughterhouse. And the show that day wasn't just about power. It wasn't just gladiators. It was mass execution. It began with an announcement. Not whispered, not hidden, but shouted from the very heart of the city. Rome advertised its cruelty the way we advertise blockbuster movies. Wooden boards, smeared with chalk, were posted in the forum. The schedule was clear. On this day, at this hour, in the Colosseum, the people would see something new. Not gladiators, not criminals, not lions versus hunters. A special feature, a spectacle so novel that the entire city buzzed with morbid curiosity. The headliners, 1,000 Christians, rounded up like cattle, set to die in a single afternoon. This wasn't random chaos. It was calculated showmanship. Rome didn't kill in silence. It killed with style. The people had grown bored of the usual gladiator fights. They wanted more blood, more shock, more theater. The emperors obliged, because the games weren't just entertainment, they were politics. Every massacre was propaganda, a way to remind the poor that bread came from Caesar, and mercy came from Caesar, and if you dared to cross him, death came too. Picture the anticipation. For weeks, whispers spread across taverns and marketplaces. This would be different. This would be unforgettable. Imagine the hype of a modern Super Bowl combined with the sick allure of a public execution. Families planned their day around it. Merchants stocked food and wine. Parents told children they'd be witnessing history. And the Christians, they were dragged from prisons, branded with shame, and paraded toward the Colosseum in chains, knowing that they were not participants in a trial, but actors in a play they hadn't chosen. The cruelty wasn't only in the violence, it was in the way the violence was framed. The Christians weren't presented as ordinary people. They were billed as villains, traitors, conspirators. Posters and criers painted them as dangerous radicals threatening the empire. Rome needed the crowd not just to accept the killing, but to enjoy it. So the Christians were dehumanized before they ever set foot in the sand. When the day arrived, the Colosseum filled with a tide of voices, 50,000 citizens, roaring with excitement. Senators reclined in cushioned seats. Commoners crammed the wooden benches, all staring at the same central stage. And when the gates creaked open, the condemned filed in. No weapons, no armor, no hope. Just human beings corralled into an arena built to devour them. Think of the cruelty in the logistics alone. Officials scheduled the killings like an entertainment program, interspersing executions between animal hunts and gladiator bouts, as if death were a halftime show. 1,000 lives reduced to stagecraft. The games began with warm-up acts, beast fights, exotic displays of animals from Africa and Asia, and then, when the crowd's bloodlust had ripened, the Christians were brought forward. Their entry was a spectacle in itself. Some were dressed in rags, some in costumes mocking their faith. Shackled together, forced to stumble across the sand, they were jeered at by the audience who had been primed to see them as monsters rather than victims. The Romans called it justice, but it was theater, pure and simple, the state transforming execution into performance, propaganda into entertainment. It's hard to imagine today, but picture walking into a stadium where the big screen doesn't show a kickoff or a concert, but prisoners waiting to be killed. No virtual violence, no Hollywood illusions, real people, real blood. The Colosseum was the original reality show, except the losers didn't go home humiliated. They went home in pieces or not at all. And yet, despite the horror, the crowd cheered. They didn't just tolerate the cruelty. They demanded it. The Romans craved novelty, and the Christians were the latest innovation. The more bizarre the death, the louder the applause. Rome had found a new way to keep its people entertained, not just by killing, but by killing in character, turning human beings into unwilling actors in the empire's most grotesque drama. And this was only the beginning. The executions hadn't even begun to show their true savagery, because Rome understood one thing: death alone wasn't entertaining enough. To really grip the crowd, you needed humiliation, you needed mockery, you needed to break a person before you killed them. The Christians thought they were walking into execution. What they didn't know was that first, they would be forced into roles in a twisted play. It wasn't just death. They were forced into humiliating theater first. It wasn't enough to kill them. Death alone was too quick, too merciful, too boring. Rome needed theater. And so, the condemned weren't just prisoners. They were cast in a grotesque play, forced to reenact the myths and legends Rome worshipped, rewritten with their suffering as the punchline. The crowd didn't want a clean execution. They wanted humiliation first. They wanted to laugh while the victims screamed. So the Christians were dressed in costumes, stripped of dignity, and shoved into roles in a twisted pantomime. Imagine being marched into the world's biggest stadium, not as yourself, but as the villain in a story designed to end in your death. That's what Rome staged. Mythological farces with real blood as the ink. One prisoner might be dressed as Orpheus, the tragic musician of legend, lured into playing his lyre before being mauled by wild beasts, released into the arena. Another would be made to play Hercules' enemies, thrown into impossible battles, mocked as cowards, before being slaughtered. Others were forced into the roles of criminals from Roman folklore, thieves, traitors, rapists, condemned to die in a way that fit their crime. But these weren't criminals, they weren't characters, they were real people, guilty only of refusing to worship the empire's gods. The cruelty wasn't hidden, it was scripted. Stagehands dressed victims in animal skins, sewing them into hides of wolves or leopards, then releasing hunting dogs to tear them apart, so that the myth of wild beasts devouring sinners could play out live. The audience laughed. To them it wasn't horror, it was comedy, a parody where human agony was the punchline. Rome perfected psychological warfare disguised as fun. It wasn't enough to break the body. They had to break the soul, to make a mother stand before 50,000 people and hear her children jeer as she was mocked as a witch, to turn faith into a costume and ridicule it before extinguishing it, to ensure that the condemned died not as martyrs, but as clowns in the eyes of the crowd. Think about the cruelty behind that. It would be like forcing modern prisoners onto a stage, dressing them in parodies of Hollywood villains, then executing them in front of a laughing audience that paid for tickets. It was ancient reality TV with no chance of survival, no prize for winning, no dignity left intact. Just humiliation followed by death. For Rome, humiliation wasn't just part of the spectacle. It was the spectacle. To degrade the Christians was to strip away their humanity, to convince the mob that what they were watching wasn't people being murdered, but villains being punished. And in that lie, Rome found its genius, because once the victims were reduced to caricatures, the crowd could laugh at their pain, cheer their deaths, and leave satisfied, convinced they had witnessed justice instead of butchery. Some Christians resisted even in costume. Eyewitness accounts tell of men and women who stood tall, refusing to play their roles, praying aloud as the mockery unfolded. Their defiance turned the script upside down, transforming Roman parody into Christian martyrdom. But that only enraged the audience further. To them, the Christians weren't supposed to have dignity. They weren't supposed to show faith. They were supposed to crawl, beg, entertain, and then die. And yet, through all the staged laughter, there was a darker hunger in the air. Because humiliation could only entertain for so long. The crowd didn't come to watch theater, they came for blood. The plays were foreplay. What everyone in the Colosseum was waiting for was the crescendo, the violence that would follow once the masks were stripped away and the real killing began. The costumes would be torn, the stage would be cleared, and the props would be forgotten. What came next wasn't parody. It wasn't myth. It was raw, unfiltered savagery, unleashed not by actors or playwrights, but by nature itself. Because once the crowd had laughed enough, it was time to scream. And then came the animals. The gates creaked open, and the roar that followed wasn't human. It was primal. From the darkness of the tunnels beneath the Colosseum surged the Empire's most terrifying weapons. Lions, leopards, bears, panthers, starved for days, whipped into frenzy, unleashed not on gladiators trained to fight, but on unarmed men and women. This wasn't myth anymore. This wasn't parody. This was Rome pitting nature itself against its victims. And the crowd loved it. The Romans called it the Venatii, the hunt. But it wasn't really a hunt. A hunt implies skill, a chase, a test between predator and prey. Here there was no contest. The Christians were naked, bound, or left defenseless with nothing but their bare hands. They were dropped into the sand like scraps of meat, while cages burst open and beasts thundered toward them. Imagine the chaos. A lion lunges, its jaws closing around a man's throat. A panther tears into a woman's back as she stumbles. Bears stand upright, swiping their claws through flesh as if tearing parchment. The Colosseum floor became a screaming blur of fur, teeth and blood. It was not battle. It was butchery, dressed up as entertainment. The audience roared louder than the beasts. They didn't flinch at the carnage. They cheered it. Children pointed, vendors sold nuts and wine. Senators leaned forward in fascination. And when a victim's body was ripped apart too quickly, the crowd groaned, as though the entertainment had ended too soon. Rome didn't just crave blood. It craved spectacle, the long-drawn agony, the tearing apart of human beings stretched into a kind of art form. Sometimes, handlers deliberately staged the scenes for maximum cruelty. Victims were tied to stakes so they couldn't move, left screaming as leopards clawed them apart. Others were smeared with animal fat to ensure the lions went for them first. Some were bound together so that when one fell, the other had to watch before being mauled themselves. The animals weren't just killers, they were props, trained and starved to create suffering on cue. It's easy to look back and think of this as primitive, but ask yourself, is it really so different from how we consume violence today? We may not throw people to lions in a stadium, but we do devour brutality through screens, viral videos of fights, disasters, executions, shared, replayed, consumed as entertainment. Rome didn't invent cruelty. It just industrialized it. The symbolism wasn't lost on the victims. For Christians, being thrown to the beasts wasn't just death. It was erasure. To the Romans, it was proof that they were no different than animals beneath human dignity, prey to be torn apart. To the audience, it was reassurance. These people are not like us. Their suffering means nothing. The state made sure the line between citizen and victim was clear. One side laughed, the other bled. But sometimes the script slipped. Ancient sources describe Christians who refused to scream, who prayed even as lions lunged, who looked upward as if already seeing heaven. Their calm unnerved the crowd, because it shattered the illusion they were supposed to die as cowards, not as martyrs. Rome wanted to humiliate them, but their faith turned their deaths into defiance. And defiance, even in chains, was contagious. Still, the cruelty overwhelmed everything. The Colosseum floor became a graveyard of shredded corpses, broken bones, and blood-soaked sand. Slaves dragged away mangled remains, spread fresh sand, and prepared for the next act, as if nothing had happened. For the audience, it was just intermission. For the victims, it was annihilation. And yet, even as the beasts tore bodies apart, the true horror hadn't yet arrived. Because what came next would prove that the greatest predator in the Colosseum wasn't lion, leopard, or bear. It was man. Because human cruelty outdid even the lions. The beasts had done their work. Bodies had been shredded, throats torn, screams silenced. For most empires, that would have been enough. But Rome was never satisfied with enough. To them, killing was not the climax. It was just one act in a longer performance. If the lions ended things too quickly, there was always another way to keep the crowd entertained. And so Rome invented tortures, not in dungeons, not in secrecy, but under the bright sun in front of 50,000 witnesses. The Colosseum became a laboratory of pain. When animals weren't dramatic enough, executioners turned to fire. Victims were tied to stakes and set ablaze, their bodies turned into living torches that lit the afternoon sky. The crowd watched as flesh blistered and curled, as people writhed against their bonds, as their screams echoed off the marble. Rome had always loved fire as a symbol of power. Now it was entertainment. Imagine a halftime show where the performers are human beings burning alive. That was Rome's idea of spectacle. Other times, crucifixion returned, not on a lonely hill, but right in the center of the arena. Rows of Christians nailed to crosses, stretched out under the sun, left to hang for hours while the crowd drank, ate and jeered. The Romans had turned the slow death of suffocation into a public art form. What once had been an execution reserved for rebels was repurposed as theater. The Colosseum floor became a forest of crosses, and the audience watched as human beings withered away, not in silence, but in agony. And still, it went further. Victims were dressed in costumes, mocked as criminals or mythological figures, then subjected to theatrical executions. A man cast as Icarus might be hoisted up and dropped to his death, his broken body laughed at as hubris punished. A woman forced into the role of Darce, a mythological queen, might be tied to the horns of a bull and dragged until her body shattered. These weren't random acts of cruelty. They were scripted, rehearsed, staged like a grotesque drama, where every scream was part of the entertainment package. There were even more grotesque inventions. Some victims were wrapped in flammable pitch and ignited, their burning bodies carried around the arena as if they were torches lighting the games. Others were made to fight each other, unarmed, starved, promised survival if they killed their fellow prisoners, a promise that was rarely kept. The cruelty was limitless because the empire's appetite was limitless. Death wasn't the goal. Prolonged suffering was. Think of it this way: if the lions were the shock value, the tortures were the slow burn. Like a horror movie stretched into hours, each scene designed to escalate the tension, to squeeze out every drop of fear, pain, and humiliation before the inevitable end. Rome wasn't just killing Christians, it was producing theater of cruelty so elaborate that even modern horror films feel tame by comparison. And what makes it worse is the audience's role. They weren't horrified, they weren't traumatized, they were entertained. Senators who prided themselves on reason and philosophy laughed while men burned alive. Families who worshipped the Roman gods clapped while women were dragged by bulls across the sand. The empire that built aqueducts and libraries also engineered tortures, so creative, so sadistic, they could only be described as genius turned monstrous. The hypocrisy was staggering. Rome claimed to embody law and order, yet the Colosseum was lawlessness sanctified. It claimed to be a beacon of civilization, yet it showcased barbarism so refined it outstripped the wildest savagery of nature. The Christians were not executed because they posed a threat, but because their deaths were useful, politically, theatrically, and above all, as a reminder to the masses: never resist Rome. And the crowd understood the message, even if they pretended it was just fun. Every scream on the sand was a warning carved into flesh. This could be you. Every burning body was propaganda, every crucifix a symbol that loyalty meant survival, and defiance meant humiliation before death. But even as the empire drowned the Colosseum in blood, there was a deeper sickness festering inside. Because the real spectacle wasn't the bodies on the sand, it was the empire itself. dressed in the costume of civilization while indulging in cruelty that outdid the beasts, outdid the flames, outdid the crosses. And yet somehow it gets even worse, because the very people who condemned others as barbaric for rejecting Roman gods, the same men who lectured about virtue and reason, sat in those seats with wine in hand, calling this justice. But the hypocrisy makes it even worse. Rome loved to call itself the light of the world. Senators boasted of their laws, philosophers lectured on virtue, poets sang about reason and order. The empire portrayed itself as the pinnacle of civilization, the great divider between barbarism and culture. And yet, all of that rhetoric collapsed the moment you stepped inside the Colosseum. Because there, in the marble heart of Rome, the mask slipped. Civilization didn't just tolerate barbarism, it monetized it, glorified it, and called it justice. This is the paradox at the core of Rome. The same society that gave us Stoic philosophy, with its ideals of self-control and rationality, also paid money to watch people burned alive. The same empire that preserved laws on contracts, inheritance, and property ignored those laws the moment someone wasn't a citizen. The Colosseum was filled with men who hydrated Plato in the morning and cheered crucifixions in the afternoon. Hypocrisy wasn't an accident of Rome. It was the empire's foundation stone. Take the senators. They wore white togas, symbols of purity, as they sat in their cushioned seats watching the sand run red with blood. They nodded sagely about justice while laughing at the spectacle of human beings being torn apart. They prided themselves on being civilized in comparison to the savages they conquered, Gauls, Britons, Jews, Christians, while behaving with a savagery so elaborate it made their enemies look merciful. Rome's cruelty was systematic, calculated, engineered by architects and stagehands. No barbarian tribe ever built a stadium for slaughter. Only civilization could. The philosophers were no different. Men like Seneca wrote about mercy and virtue, but even he admitted to watching the games, horrified yet unable to look away. Others defended the arena as necessary for the moral fiber of the people, claiming it was better for citizens to vent their passions in spectacle than in rebellion. In other words, let them cheer while strangers burn, so they won't rise against the state. It was hypocrisy dressed as pragmatism, moral philosophy weaponized as an excuse for cruelty. And the people, they weren't passive victims of propaganda, they were complicit. Ordinary Romans may have lived in cramped apartments, worked back-breaking jobs, and suffered under taxes, but when the games arrived, they poured into the Colosseum, they brought their children, cheered the deaths, demanded novelty. Hypocrisy wasn't just at the top, it was woven into the crowd itself. Rome promised them bread, gave them circuses, and in return the people surrendered their empathy. The Colosseum didn't just kill Christians, it killed conscience. The empire framed it all as justice. Officials declared the victims criminals, traitors, enemies of the gods. But the reality was simpler. They were props. Their suffering was state-sponsored theater. Rome called itself a beacon of law, but its laws bent and broke whenever the crowd demanded blood. It called itself a temple of virtue, but it worshipped cruelty in the most public square of all. Rome defined barbarism as agony outside its walls, never seeing that the truest barbarism was happening at the center of its empire. And yet, Rome never recognized the irony. In its own eyes, this was civilization perfected, power displayed in marble, order kept through fear, entertainment delivered through death. It wasn't ashamed, it was proud. The Colosseum wasn't a guilty secret. It was a crown jewel paraded to foreign dignitaries, proof of Rome's greatness. The empire didn't hide its cruelty, it broadcast it. That's how deep the hypocrisy ran. Rome could massacre thousands, then point to its aqueducts and libraries as proof that it was civilized. It's the same mask you see throughout history. States that preach virtue while practicing cruelty. Leaders who speak of law and justice while ignoring both. When it's convenient, societies that insist on their enlightenment while delighting in the suffering of others. Rome didn't invent hypocrisy, but it perfected it. And still, beneath the marble, beneath the rhetoric, a crack was spreading. Because the very people Rome mocked, humiliated, and slaughtered refused to break. They refused to renounce their faith, even when tied to crosses, even when thrown to beasts, even when burned alive. And in that refusal lay the one thing Rome never expected: resistance. Not rebellion with swords and spears, but defiance with faith. And that defiance would turn the empire's cruelty against itself. But the true horror was psychological. The Colosseum was designed to crush, to humiliate, to terrify, to annihilate. And in most cases it worked. Criminals begged for mercy, slaves screamed in terror, rebels broke down under the jeers of the crowd. But the Christians didn't behave the way Rome expected. When dragged into the sand, they didn't renounce their God. They didn't curse Caesar. Many didn't even scream. Instead, they prayed, they sang, they forgave. And in that refusal to play their assigned role, Rome's carefully scripted theater began to collapse. The empire wanted them broken, reduced to cowards, mocked as criminals, erased in laughter. But instead, some Christians met death with a calm so unsettling it unnerved the audience. Eyewitness accounts describe men and women facing beasts while their lips moved in prayer. Mothers holding their children as lions advanced, whispering hymns instead of cries. Victims crucified in the sand, lifting their eyes skyward, as if already seeing something beyond Rome. To the crowd, this wasn't just strange, it was disturbing, because the Colosseum depended on humiliation. Without fear, without begging, without despair, the spectacle lost its power. When a man burned alive but refused to curse, when a woman dragged by bulls called out to her God instead of screaming, it broke the illusion that Rome was in control. It turned a killing into a testimony. Every drop of blood became a sermon Rome couldn't silence. And that was dangerous. The whole purpose of the games was to terrify the public into submission, to show them that Caesar was absolute, that resistance was pointless. But instead, the Christians' defiance spread whispers. If they could face lions without fear, if they could forgive their killers in the flames, then maybe Caesar wasn't the true master of life and death. Maybe there was something stronger than Rome. The empire had intended to erase Christianity by making it a joke, by turning its believers into stage props. Instead, it gave them martyrs, and martyrs are the one thing no empire can afford. A corpse is silent. A martyr speaks forever. Stories of these deaths spread faster than Rome expected. Survivors whispered them in marketplaces, neighbors retold them in alleyways, travelers carried them across provinces. What the empire staged as theater became legend, and legends have a power all their own. Rome thought it was silencing a sect. Instead, it was writing the first chapters of a religion that would one day bury the empire itself. Think about the irony. Rome controlled armies, fleets, provinces, and wealth beyond imagination. The Christians had nothing, no weapons, no cities, no power. Yet on the sand of the Colosseum, stripped naked, chained, humiliated, they won a battle Rome didn't even understand was being fought. Because by refusing to die on Rome's terms, they transformed slaughter into seed. Every martyr made the faith stronger, not weaker. Every execution spread Christianity further, not less. It's one of history's cruelest paradoxes. The empire that tried to annihilate a faith ended up amplifying it. Rome thought it was killing a cult. It was feeding a revolution. And beneath that irony is the psychological horror. Imagine being an emperor, spending fortunes on spectacles meant to erase your enemies, only to realize that every drop of blood spilled in the Colosseum was creating new believers. That instead of proving your power, you had exposed your weakness. You could break bodies, but you couldn't break faith. The audience may have laughed, jeered, demanded blood, but somewhere among them, someone would go home shaken. Someone would whisper about the prisoners who prayed as they burned. Someone would remember the mother who sang while beasts tore her apart. And those whispers, passed from voice to voice, outlived the roars of the Colosseum. Rome had staged the ultimate humiliation, but humiliation turned into defiance. Defiance turned into legend, and legend turned into empire, not Rome's, but Christianity's. The Colosseum was supposed to be a monument to Rome's eternal power. Instead, it became the birthplace of a movement Rome could never kill. And if that sounds like poetic justice, just wait, because the legacy of blood didn't end with faith. It seeped far beyond the Colosseum, shaping centuries of history in ways Rome could never have imagined. But the true horror wasn't just what happened that day. It was how the echoes of that day still haunt us. The Colosseum still stands, cracked, ruined, but defiant against time. Tourists walk its corridors, snapping photos, marveling at the engineering, the arches, the echo of history in stone. But the walls don't tell the truth. They don't whisper what they've seen. Beneath the glamour of ruins lies the memory of 1,000 deaths. One afternoon where blood pooled in the sand, where an empire turned cruelty into entertainment. And the legacy of that day didn't die with the bodies. It lived on, shaping the world in ways more horrifying, more enduring than Rome could have imagined. For Christianity, the massacre was not an ending, but a beginning. The martyrs Rome created became the lifeblood of a faith that spread across the empire like wildfire. Every execution, every humiliation, every scream was remembered not as defeat, but as proof of unbreakable belief. Rome thought it was stamping out a sect. Instead, it made saints, and those saints turned a persecuted minority into a global religion that would one day sit on the throne of the very city that once tried to erase it. The empire of marble crumbled. The empire of faith endured. But the legacy isn't just religious. It's cultural, because the Colosseum taught a dangerous lesson, that cruelty can be normalized if you wrap it in spectacle, that a crowd will cheer atrocity if it's staged as entertainment. Rome industrialized this idea, but it didn't keep it. The blueprint survived. You can see it in every regime that paraded enemies in show trials, in every propaganda campaign that dehumanized victims before destroying them, in every crowd that laughed, cheered, or looked away as cruelty was carried out in the name of order. And here is the most uncomfortable truth. The mindset of the Colosseum isn't ancient. It isn't gone. It's alive. Every time violence goes viral, every time suffering is consumed like content, every time people cheer cruelty from the safety of the crowd, we are staring into Rome's mirror. The marble is cracked, the lions are gone, but the hunger remains. Rome proved that civilization doesn't erase barbarism. It refines it, dresses it in velvet, and sells tickets at the door. That's why the Colosseum is not just a ruin, it's a warning, a reminder that cruelty thrives when it's dressed as culture, that an empire can brag of justice while feasting on injustice, that we can mistake atrocity for entertainment if the spectacle is grand enough. Rome is gone, but the echoes of its games reverberate in every society that forgets the cost of blood. The day Rome executed 1,000 Christians wasn't just an atrocity. It was a revelation. It showed the terrifying ease with which ordinary people can become accomplices, how laughter can drown out screams, how marble facades can hide rivers of blood. The Colosseum may be silent now, its sands clean, its cages empty, but the true horror is knowing that what happened there could happen anywhere, anytime, as long as a crowd is willing to watch. Because the Colosseum is still standing. And so is the mindset that built it.